Hey, welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about the gold confiscation that happened in the US back in 1933. This comes up a lot when people worry that the US government might seize various crypto assets. So, in order to figure out whether or not that could happen, let's go back in time and figure out what happened back in 1933. Hey, welcome to the show. I'm Molly. Today we're going to talk about the gold confiscation that happened back in 1933. So this was 90 years ago. Nobody alive today was old enough to remember that experience. So we kind of have to rely on history books. And one of the unfortunate realities is that sometimes history gets rewritten. So hopefully the research that I've done is accurate in depicting what happened way back then in 1933. So during the 1920s, there was a very large expansion in the money supply. It was partly in response to World War I and partly just a natural effort of growing the economy, lots of booming stock market, new money was being created, some stimulus type things going. Everybody thought it was awesome because the stock market was going up and everyone felt rich. However, when you inflate the money supply and your money is backed by gold, which it was back then, you run into this problem. And this led to Executive Order number 6102, which was issued in May of 1933. President at the time was FDR. And I'm going to just read some of the specifics about what this executive order stated. It was kind of done in a couple of different steps because you do need an act of Congress to actually implement something like this. But it began with this executive order that required U.S. citizens to deliver on or before May 1st of 1933. So this is like early in the Depression, but definitely several years in. All but a small amount of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates owned by them to the Federal Reserve in exchange for $20.67 per troy ounce. So a couple things we want to clarify as we go through this. The initial forced buyback required that people sell their gold to the Federal Reserve, which is a private entity that acts as an agent for the US government and had been put into place about 20 years before in 1913. And this dictated the price to be $20 per troy ounce. And a troy ounce is a little bit different than our normal ounce system that we're used to, in that there are 12 troy ounces in a pound, where normally in our modern world there are 16 ounces in a pound. So that's the difference there. Now, back in 1917, the Trading with the Enemy Act was put into place by the president at the time, I think was Wilson. And this gave the president the power to oversee and restrict any and all trade between the United States and its enemy in times of war. One interesting thing about this act, I'm going to sort of jump forward in time, is that it seems like it was selectively enforced and used as a tool, because during the late 1930s, when the Nazis were building up and when Nazi Germany had been declared an enemy, I'm not sure what year that was, late 30s probably, there was a lot of US businesses that were given exceptions and were still allowed to trade with the Nazis during the war period, including companies like IG Farben, which is connected to a lot of other US businesses and US banks. So it's interesting how this, nefarious activity is also tied to the Trading with the Enemy Act, which, when we knew years later with World War II, was also used as a tool to suppress some companies from participating in trade, but lots of companies that had connections with the US government were given exceptions. So back to this gold thing, the Trading with the Enemy Act was amended in 1933, and it became punishable by law, a fine of $10,000 if you were caught not, with this gold. If you had more than 5 ounces of gold, you were now in violation of the law. And the fine was $10,000, which in today's money is $229,000. So that's a chunk of change. That's a hefty fine. Or 10 years in prison. Actually, potentially you could have had both. So if you were caught with gold, you were fined the equivalent of like $250,000 and you had to go to jail for 10 years. Like, that is not an insignificant punishment. Now, I read through a bunch. I've also, one of the reasons I wanted to do this is you read random things on Twitter. I saw someone claim that this whole gold buyback thing was much ado about nothing and that like nobody really got in trouble and it wasn't really a big deal. I went through the Wikipedia stuff and I'm not going to read all of them to you, but there was quite a few court cases where people were prosecuted for failing to sell their gold. So this was not a ignored thing and it was enforced and most people complied because this was a different era. You didn't have the internet, weren't like major distrust in government. People were kind of going through the depression, which was a really rough time, and there was trust that why would the government have us do something that wasn't in our interest? So there was an exception to this rule. And the exception, which I just mentioned before, was that you could have basically up to $100 worth. You could have 5 ounces of gold. And the nice thing about this was this is not a lot of gold to be able to keep 5 ounces, but it kept a lot of people happy because they felt like if you were poor, 5 ounces was a bunch. So, like, it created support among a certain group of people whom the president at the time needed support from because he was a very socialist in a lot of his policies. All right. The president actually does, these executive orders are not always enforceable by law because we do have a Congress that creates laws. So in 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act. And let's read a little bit of this to you. All gold and certificates held by the Federal Reserve were forced to be surrendered and vested in the sole title of the U.S. Department of the Treasury and changed the value of the dollar in gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 an ounce. So at this stage, which was almost a year later, the gold that had been sold to the Fed was now moved to the Treasury and revalued at a much higher rate. And when I first read this, I'm like, wow, did the Fed make a quick buck? They bought this stuff at $20 and now it's $35 and they got this 67% increase. It doesn't really seem like that. It seemed like it was just given, which is fine. Fed has other ways to work their magic. But what was a clever move to maintain support of voters was that the people who had this 5 ounces of gold, which $100 worth, it's certainly way more then than it is now, but it wasn't exactly a tremendous amount of money. They now saw their gold go up in value a ton. So there was some excitement about that. But gold was no longer money really in the eyes of consumers at this point because if you couldn't have gold, you couldn't use gold for payments. So you had this little bit for savings, but gold was no longer tied to money. This was sort of the birth of fiat in essence, in that it was backed by the faith and trust of the US government and no longer redeemable for gold at this point. That officially ended in 1971 in a different capacity because after this point, countries could own gold and banks could own gold and global trade was still done. Things were settled in gold. But in terms of payments from person to person, gold was no longer used as money by people like us. Now, this ended in one capacity in 1974 with another executive order, number 11825. This was General Gerald Ford who repealed this executive order from Roosevelt. And now it became okay to own gold. But it was necessary because at the same time, Congress restored the Americans' right to own gold. So this window of banning gold ownership lasted for 41 years. You couldn't own it. You went to jail. You faced serious fines, and there were prosecutions for it. Now, that I don't think much of this is disputed. It's well published that this happened. I mean, I've showed you the screenshot of the actual executive order itself. The more interesting question to me is why? Why do this? Well, as I mentioned, in 1920s, there was a expanding economy. Stock market was growing. There's a very high correlation between a booming stock market and money printer go burr. So we've seen this a couple of times, this massive sort of pump, a bull market. It looks like everyone's making money and everything's profitable, when in essence, you're just doing this supply and demand game where you have more dollars chasing the same number of stocks in some case, which drives the value up. Not really a true growth in essence. People had not become more productive. They just simply had access to more cash. The money supply grew, which is another driver of inflation. So anyway, after this boom ended in 1929 with the stock market crash, there was a lot of fear and anxiety, a little bit similar to kind of what we're experiencing right now. And this drove people to hoard money. If you're very worried you're not going to be able to pay the rent next month or buy food, you're not going to go out and buy new stuff that you don't really need. And so in economist terms, this means that the velocity of money slowed down, and people were also becoming a little bit worried about this paper money that they had, which is a gold certificate. And there was concern on the part of the US government, the Treasury, and the Fed that if people got distrustful enough and they wanted to swap their certificates for actual gold, there wasn't enough. And this is also very similar to what happened in 1971, where we have this pattern, this temptation to issue more paper representations of the physical asset. It's just too easy. Nobody's watching, nobody's paying attention. It'll be fine. Like, we won't have, all the people aren't going to want to cash in at once until one day they do. And one day enough people say, hey, I'd like my gold back, please. This happened with France in 1971, but there was a concern about it happening back in 1933, which is why it's believed that this was done as a proactive measure to prevent a run on banks. They didn't want all the citizens going out and swapping their dollars for gold, so instead they made it illegal to own gold. Now, the logical next step for citizens, if they're told you can't own gold, you have concerns about the value of this fiat money. What do you do next? Silver. So in 1934, there was also the Silver Tax Act, which was imposed, and that lasted for about 30 years until 1963. And this made it that any entity that made a profit on the transfer of silver bullion had to pay a full 50% of that profit as tax. That's serious. So people were not going to use silver as a medium of exchange because of this incredibly hefty tax. So you had these sort of two mechanisms that were really preventing people from sound money and from storing their own wealth in hard assets. And to me, this raises the fundamental question of, do citizens have a right to decide where they store their wealth, or does the government have the right to sort of do this greater good type of policy and say, for the greater good of our monetary system, we're going to prevent a run on banks by making it illegal to possess gold? Interesting philosophical question. I tend to be in the camp of citizens have more power than the government, and we should be able to decide how and where we want to store our wealth. I'm not generally a fan of greater good type of legislation that inadvertently takes wealth away from citizens without them really understanding that. There were some big court cases. One I just wanted to read about, which was interesting to me, that there was an attorney in New York named Frederick Barber Campbell. He had a bank account at Chase, and he had 5,000 ounces of gold. And when Campbell attempted to withdraw the gold, Chase refused, and Campbell sued. So he had like some kind of account. Like, I guess you could keep your gold in like a bank account back then and go withdraw it from the vault, and they wouldn't let him do it. So he sued. And the federal prosecutor then indicted Campbell for not surrendering this gold. Ultimately, the prosecution of Campbell failed. I'm not exactly sure why, but the government seized the gold and Campbell no longer had his gold. So there were real situations where assets were taken. There was also another interesting thing that happened, which is a lot of people who maybe didn't want to turn over their gold kept it in a safety deposit box in the bank. Those are secret. You have these secret keys and nobody should know what's in there, just between you and the banker. And how's anybody going to know? Well, over 3,000 banks failed during the 1930s. Turns out that if you had a safety deposit box at a bank and your bank fails and you don't go to collect your stuff, then it becomes property of the US Treasury. Well, what would happen if during this failure, you go to the bank to get your stuff out of the safety deposit box and a employee of the US government, prosecutor, or a cop or whatever, is standing there watching, and you open up your box and you got the gold in there. You have this dilemma. Do I want to risk it and try to get my gold back? Or is it not worth it because I'm not allowed to have this gold in the first place? And because now the bank is owned by the government in some capacity, it's failed, I could risk getting prosecuted. So inadvertently, quite a bit of gold was confiscated by the US government at zero cost to them because of this safety deposit box business that happened from the 3,000 plus bank failures. So the question then becomes, do we think it's possible for the US government to seize an asset in the future? It looks like in the two instances where major policy changes were made with gold, it was done to avoid the fiat scam being exposed and the overprinting of paper becoming evident to everybody, leading to a bank run to pull the gold assets out. We don't live in that world now. So it's not easy to have a direct comparison of like, could what happened then happen now? Nobody uses gold for money, really. I mean, banks and nations can use it to settle up trade, but as far as average citizens, gold has not been part of our money system for a long time. There's a lot of chatter and data that other countries are moving back to asset-backed currencies, which means that gold could play a new role in the money supply. But when it comes to digital assets, I think we'd have to see a situation where the digital asset would become somehow of a threat to the everyday money situation. Now, when it comes to XRP, one of the questions that has come up is, should the XRP ledger be deemed a CFIUS, a strategically important financial institution, because it is selected to be essentially the global marketplace where all the money is moved? Would that make this an asset that was deemed important for like national security reasons and therefore seized in this capacity of like they force you to buy it back at a fair market value? It doesn't really look like the $20 per troy ounce was fair market value, but again, this was before the internet. People weren't aware of their rights and didn't distrust that the government was trying to kind of seize their asset, maybe not for their own benefit. But for XRP, could the government seize it? They would have to prove that it's for the greater good, which can be done. I mean, it's sort of an eminent domain type of situation. And this type of thing, moving to a new monetary system on the blockchain where you have this very different type of centralized marketplace, not that the XRP ledger is centralized in terms of consensus, but meaning you have a lot of global trade being done in one blockchain where all the money can be moved effortlessly or quickly and efficiently. And so the question then becomes, would a government or a world entity like the IMF be able to declare this to be something that is so strategically important that only certain types of individuals could hold it? I think that's very unlikely, personally. That doesn't mean I don't think that XRP could be locked for institutional investors at some point, or my highest probability theory at this point is a lot of the liquidity trading could be done in a marketplace that you need a specific NFT to access. So if you watch my video where we talked about this in the context of being like a casino marketplace, there's this sort of high roller room where some of the trading is only done for people who could qualify. This goes beyond a creditor investor. This is more like institutional investor, nation or bank or type of thing. So I don't think that we'll see the same logical argument for a seizure of a digital asset like XRP like we saw for gold. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other scenarios where a forced buyback could occur via something more along the lines of eminent domain. We have to sort of see how this plays out. And the point of this video wasn't for me to really speculate what could happen in the future as much as to lay out the events that happened back in 1933. And I think it's pretty clear that it was done twice, actually, in 1971 as well, to protect the US dollar and the gold from the run on the banks to take all the gold. And we don't really have that perfect analogy in this next situation. So we have seen in the past that the government will force the seizure of assets in certain situations that are to protect their interests. We could see that in the future. I think the situation would just be quite different. And there would have to be another logical argument for why taking these assets is for the greater good. This is why it's really important to establish a fair market value of XRP. Should this happen, should there be another gold type seizure in different circumstances, we want to make sure that the government compensates us at the highest possible value, which might sound like a crazy number, but if you're forced into this situation where you have to give up something that you don't really want to give up, at least the compensation of getting, paid in a very high amount would be better than nothing, or be better than, being given a very low ball price. So anyway, that's my little recap of the gold confiscation back from 1933. If you found this helpful, please like the video. I guess I'll put it up there. Like the video and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.